Today we're visiting Dover Castle. And what a castle! I'm going to have to be quick because it is one of the most large and complicated and historic castles in Britain. I've been there 5 times and I've never not been there at the end when they're kicking you out, no matter how early I get there. Because you have over 1,000 years of history from a Roman lighthouse with some medieval amendments, Norman structures. There's a Norman keep, there's medieval battlements, there's medieval tunnels, proper siege tunnels zigzagging through the triple moats. And you can actually see it in the distance over there. That brick structure is actually the tunnel where it comes out above ground. And then it has 2 rows of encircling battlements, which date from a mixture of Middle Ages through to Napoleonic. There's Second World War tunnels underneath here, several miles. You can actually go through about half a mile of it, but there's something like 3 miles just at the one end down the far end there. And there's more at this end. So overall, it's something like 6 or 7 miles of tunnels on 3 levels from 3 different parts of the tunnel, a lot of which date back to the Napoleonic era and just before. But we're going to come through the main entrance. You have to give your ticket, and even if you're a member, I would recommend booking in advance because this castle is popular because it is one of the largest and most complete and covers so many eras of British history. But as you come through into the light, you see the inner bailey. Round here is, if you turn to the right, you can head down towards the Middle Ages and the First World War and Second World War signalling tower, which sadly we didn't get to today. We ran out of time because of roadwork delays on the motorway. But beautiful castle, really striking. And you can see it's that typical Norman mentality of build a castle which is so impregnable, it's unthinkable to attack it. Well, Dover is the entry point to Britain from Europe. It always has been and still to a pretty large degree is. The modern day ferry port sits at the base of the cliffs at the other end of the castle. But we're going to start with the Middle Ages tunnels. You can see that brick bridge there. You can go up it and over and into the keep, or you can go down to the rooms below. And you can see here the entrance, there's some personal possessions, examples of how bunk beds were laid out in the Napoleonic era and shortly after, when this was a real centre for defence against Napoleon, and also the Western Heights on the hill at the other side of Dover, which I'm sure we'll cover at some point. But here, interesting room with a little bit of an introduction to the life of the soldiers. But now we're straight off into the tunnels, and we descend down this spiral staircase lined with brick and lime wash. And when you're down about 30 metres, the first set of tunnels begins. And these are medieval tunnels. They've had a concrete floor. They've obviously had a bit of a lick of paint and a railing and some fairly unobtrusive lighting. But imagine you would have gone down here in the dark with candles or a burning branch so that you could get to the defensive positions. The idea here is that you've built this wonderful castle and you have these huge walls, but then machinery of war has evolved and you have siege engines or you have undermining. So the enemy besieging a castle will dig a little hole under a weak point like a tower, set fire to that fire so that as it collapses, the heat expands the stone and the tower collapses. If you saw our pictures of our video of Rochester Castle, that's exactly what happened there, and that's how they were able to break in after 30 days of chipping away at the stone, underpinning it with wood supports, and then building a fire and setting fire to it. Here, this is from later in the Middle Ages when the siege machines, and you can see these angled windows with cannon. And here's an anti-personnel, really almost a mortar, except for its angle. And the idea is that you put these cannons and guns and people with flintlock pistols, and they can fire as an enemy tries to get over. So to get to this point, you've got over the first rampart, you've got into the moat, and as you reach the bottom of the dry moat, you're greeted by a fusillade of cannon fire shot at angles through the bricks, so you can't really shoot back. These tunnels, really, today they look like little museum pieces, but if a battle occurred, would be brutal places because they would be firing at the enemy as they came in. On that side, it's hard to really tell, but the defensive walls are near vertical and they've been brick lined, so there really is nothing to hold on to. It's a 95-degree brick wall 30 meters high, and as you come down it, you're going to have to come with ladders, siege ladders, and as you come down, you're going to be under attack by large cannons firing anti-personnel grape fire. Really nasty place to be. And now we're going to head down into the next bit of the tunnel, because the defences were always evolving, and you come down another staircase into a grimier, dirtier section with a lot of dark areas that's quite hard to see at times. You bring a head torch if you have one. It is useful when you turn down a wrong corner. But at the bottom here, you can get into what you'd normally call the moat, or you can head down another tunnel and mind your head. And there's a series of tunnels, a maze of tunnels leading underneath with these angled sights to shoot out of, and also heading down to a defensive fort, a bastion. So there's a series of bastions all the way around the overall castle, and you can get in one on the far side. We're going to skip it today because we're going into this bastion, so we didn't really get the top of the defensive wall from the Napoleonic era where you can go down a staircase and through to the bastion. But we got delayed and we arrived at nearly 12, so we had 6 hours to go around the castle. And whilst that sounds a lot, it really is a tight schedule for this castle. Deep in this section, you get an idea of just how dark it is. And there would have been no electric lights here back in the past. But as we turn around and we go down another tunnel, you start to see the light emerging at the bottom, and that's the bastion. The bastion is a defensive tower out inside the moat, which it allows for the same defensive approach that star forts or rose-shaped forts gave, where you have intersecting fields of fire. And as you get larger guns and you're moving towards fields of fire on attackers, you want interlocking without blind spots. Think of a lorry. You don't want to be the cyclist caught in the blind spot, but you also might want to creep up through that blind spot. So the idea of the bastion is that the defenders on the wall get to see the whole wall because they're outside. This did leave these towers rather exposed if they were overwhelmed, but Dover was never overwhelmed. Dover was barely ever attacked. It largely stood as a symbol of royal power. The people knew that they couldn't get rid of the Normans. You can't get in here with pitchforks and spades. And the French and other royals from Europe who visited, if they were, say, on a pilgrimage, would come and see this insurmountable task. So it was only really attacked once. Now, this is the base of the bastion, and you can see the windlass you can turn to open and close the doors to effectively lock off the tower. As we come out through this door, we come onto the outer battlements, which they're not really a battlement. There's an exterior wall, and on top is an earth bank. And you can wander along this earth bank. You can see the main body of the castle back there. And this whole section sticks out like the prow of a boat, really just offering defensive positions behind that wall, with another ditch here, and you're open to fire if you're on here. So it's purely a defensive position, but not really with cannons. You can see there what I call the prow of the boat. As we walk round this corner, I'm not going to show you too much of the battlements, but you get a feeling for how deep, even if it's wooded today, how deep that channel is. And at this stretch, it is vertical on one side and very steep earth on the other. But when you reach the end here, it turns into a near vertical brick wall with very few footholds all the way along to the end of the castle. And at the far end of the castle is the cliffs of the White Cliffs of Dover. So you see here, that's the tunnel we came out through. So well protected, hard to get into. And even if you can get down into this channel to get to it, you're being rained on with fire from all of the towers above and these side tunnels. You see one here, you can see one there in the distance. And down the other end of the castle, there's another two. So there's a whole bunch of positions where you can be caught, and it really is impregnable. If you want a picture of impregnable, it's this castle. Impossible from the sea. It's a 200-foot cliff easily, and from the land completely surrounded with multiple layers of interlocking defense. Now we're back out and we're walking our way up the wooden stairs onto this old bridge that leads above the tunnel to the main keep. Kind of see there in the distance is the Western Heights, which is another large hill which was covered in Napoleonic era fort. They're a bit swallowed by the trees now, but you can still see the grand staircase. We're heading into the main courtyard where you can see the keep in the centre, which is where royals and notable visitors and ambassadors would have rested when they first arrived in Britain, particularly during the Middle Ages. Around the outside, it's been modernised in probably Georgian era, and there are a number of small exhibitions and a small regimental museum. And we're heading into the main keep itself. There's a grand stone staircase which leads steeply up into the second floor, really. So you've got the ground floor, this is at first floor level, and then you're up to the second floor. At the top, even if you were to make it into this castle in an attack, when you reach the top, there was a gate here. On the sides, there's a small guardhouse, which would be garrisoned, and a small chapel there, way in. Proper chapels higher up within the structure. But there was a well and a guardhouse there, and you turn up this well-worn staircase. You see here a gap which has been bridged in modern time, but there's a large chasm down below. And then there is the well house and another guardhouse. As you come up yet another flight of stairs here, you emerge onto the first living floor of the castle keep. And just through the room there, you can see there's a small garderobe. Here's one of the wells. It's not as noticeable as Rochester. It's actually built into the structure of the wall. Here's the small guardhouse, which is stationed today with a few props and some helmets and swords, which unfortunately you can't play with. You can later on. There's a few shields you can hold. And a very deep well. You see here the winding table, and where that cage is very wisely placed. You look down, it is deep. You really can't see the bottom. I was quite tempted to drop a coin to see how long it was before it hit the bottom, but shouldn't really do that kind of thing in historic castle. So into the main hall. And there are two halls like this, one above the other. High up there is small peepholes, and there's a corridor on the level in between these floors. But you can get a feeling for the height of the room, and you can take a seat in the throne. It's highly encouraged. Pretty much every tourist does it. As we're heading up, there's two grand halls in the middle, one on top of each other. The walls themselves are very thick. Within the wall is these corridors. So at either end, sort of shaped into the wall, are spiral staircases and rooms. But effectively the wall is the thickness of this. And then inside that is these corridors and rooms. And then in some sections the wall really is that thick. So it's a very substantial build. We go down here, you can see this is the wall with a corridor built inside the structure of the wall. And again repeated over here. And it's quite a maze. And I have noticed that every time I come, the route seems to be slightly different. Well, not every time, but if you leave it a year or so. Because you don't go from the first floor to the second floor. You go from the grand hall up to the roof, and then you come back down to the room in the middle. Over here is the chapel. And this would have been the King's private chapel, kind of built into one of the corners. Very beautiful if austere. Split into two rooms. You see how although it's dressed internally with these lovely fan vaulting and typical Norman columns, at the same time it's cramped room to room because around the central void there are these really thick walls. And if you see my video on Rochester Castle, you'll see how after 600 years of the entire innards of the castle being destroyed and only the outside walls and the centre wall being in place, it still stands because the material is so thick and strong that it can stand under its own weight against everything for hundreds of years. And it's a very similar kind of structure. So we're just making our way up to the roof. I'll skip ahead a little bit because it's just a spiral staircase. We're going to make our way around. You can see Dover there. That's Dover down at the bottom. Not the port. The port we'll see in a little while. But that's Dover going on back along down the valley. and the Western Heights, which were a real military powerhouse of their own during Napoleonic times. And you see the seafront of Dover Harbour. I would say if you're going to look for a beach, I wouldn't go to Dover. There are much better beaches, and sorry to anyone who lives in Dover, much nicer towns to visit. But if you are in Dover, I would check out the museum. There is an excellent Neolithic boat on the second floor, and it's quite a decent little museum. Now we're looking inland, or should be looking inland. Not that much to see, but what you can see is that it's strongly defended. The castle really juts out inland, so there isn't a particularly good angle to attack the castle. Now we come over here, you can see the radio towers over there on the hill. That's the White Cliffs of Dover that you think of. They are not on the radio tower, but to the right that's where the main tower, the main White Cliffs are. And you can go to the White Cliffs. There's a National Trust car park and a little visitor centre. I would say you don't really get to see the White Cliffs because you're standing on top of them. So short of going on a ferry, you can't really see them. My personal recommendation would be Seven Sisters, where you get to see, they're not quite as high, but they look much more impressive and much more beautiful from Milland. And Milland curves, so you get what you think you're going to see. And quite often when you see the White Cliffs of Dover even on reputable television channels, they actually show Seven Sisters. As we move on round, you can see where we're heading next. There's this Anglo Saxon church, very beautiful and interesting church, and next to it is the Roman Pharos, the lighthouse, and the outer walls continue behind that, and we head down to, well, we're going to go there in a minute. But hidden behind that church and lighthouse is a beautiful 18th century building for the military, and behind that is the First and Second World War signalling tower, which is quite interesting, but sadly we didn't get to. But we're off next to this lighthouse. Lighthouse is the best preserved Roman lighthouse in Britain. From here, can you see how it goes in before it then goes up straight? The Roman bit is where it's curving in. The Middle Ages bit is on top of the original Roman Pharos. And down here in the courtyard, there's a small regimental museum. We're going to pay it a short visit, but I am trying to keep this as fast as possible because Dover Castle really does have a lot to see. Descending another of those long spiral staircases, we come through to the room above the Grand Hall. And this is actually the residence of the royals or of guests when they're in town. Down here you've got a guardrobe hidden in the wall. Nice little ensuite toilet there. And this floor is split into two sections. You have two long rooms. One is effectively a bed and living room here, and on the other side is more a dining area. But there's some interesting pieces here. You've got a Lewis chess set there. If you saw the video on the British Museum a few weeks ago, we actually saw the original. It's a lovely replica. But there's a fire burning. We could actually smell burning on the roof and in some of the corridors. And it was starting to get a little alarming until we got to here. And then we could see why there was a smell. Because you couldn't see smoke coming out above. And it seemed a very sealed roof. But then we'll head out here and down the stairs because there's so much still to see. See how the staircases don't come to the room. The spiral staircase is in the four corners, and then there's an offset steps down. So even if you break through there, you don't really break through, you're not going to break at that join. So it's yet another strength to the tower. This is down below. The kitchens, some storage rooms. Today they have some chain mail and shields, and there's a lot to be fun to be had. But I would say that they've tied down most of them, but you can take the shields out. I did take out the shield and have a little play. Then down past the storage room there is this whole kitchen area, and there's a recreation of a Middle Ages kitchen. Over there, this is like wine and beer making. That's a pulping machine for crushing and pulping the material for beer, which Kent's always been very good for hops. It's the Garden of England. It's a great place to grow stuff. It's very green, and there's always been hop houses, so it's always been a place where you get some beer. And here they have some recreations of different tables and cooking materials and types of food that they cooked. A small oven here. Well, not oven really, a cooking pot. Effectively everything was cooked on a pot or stirred. I did find the mortar and pestle in the corner there interesting. The pestle's rather large. Along with these cooking pots here, which not a world away from the ones we saw at the British Museum from Sutton Hoo, which would have been a few hundred years earlier, but very similar. Here this gentleman was explaining how a particular type of local beer was made in the castle using that machine. Then we're outside the castle, or the keep, and this is the Regimental Museum, which covers the Princess of Wales and the Queen's Regiment, which actually incorporated a bunch of different regiments, and they all have a very long history. So you can see there from the War of Spanish Succession and Peninsular War, Napoleonic Wars, various regimental dress and caps from First World War, Second World War, modern day. And inside there's brief but very good. I'm not going to give you a whole museum tour because it's probably not big enough for a Monday museum guide and not small enough to squeeze into this video. Is enjoy. It was an explanation of the Queen, who the Queen's Regiment is named after. I believe that's Queen Anne. And the history of the British Army. It's very good. If you're interested in that, I'd say you should watch the video on the British Army Museum, which really tells the history. This section's on the War of the Spanish Succession, Marlborough's wars. So, effectively, British policy for about 400 years was to maintain stability in Europe. There was no desire to take over countries within Europe, but they didn't want anyone getting ascendancy over Europe. So they didn't want France effectively controlling other countries, or Germany. So really, as it depends as times changed. But fundamentally, they got involved in the 7 Years' War and the War of the Spanish Succession and a whole series of different wars, which are really well covered there. There's an explanation of the children at the front. This is the sinking of the HMS Birkenhead off Dover, and it was very much the women and children first. So all the women and children survived, and most of the men died when the ship broke in half. And then the American War of Independence and the involvement of the regiment there, through to a series of interesting displays. This is about the Peninsular War, when the regiment was under Wellington's, Arthur Wellesley, under Wellington's command, and really pushed Napoleon out of the Iberian Peninsula. Kind of partly a strategy to stop France growing westerly, and also to support Portugal, who Britain and Portugal actually have the longest standing alliance of any countries in the world, and we have not been at war or anything but allies for something like 800 years. I'd need to look it up, but it's a long time. It's one of Victoria's scarves. Queen Victoria supposedly knitted these, and they were given to the most outstanding soldiers. And there's a whole piece about the Crimean War, along with the Maori War, the Boer War. Some tourists here getting dressed up as soldiers, having a lot of fun. And here's a lady finding out her son's died. There is a whole story to that which is explained, but if I squeeze around the side here, there's also the First Sikh War, which we never really talk about, but with the weakening of some of the countries that made up what we'd now call India today, the Sikhs saw an opportunity to grow a Sikh empire by invading the other Indian countries, and that didn't quite suit the British intentions there, so there's a little war. And here's the Boer War, a good and pretty fair explanation of the Chinese War, which, well, the Opium War. And then on to the First World War. There's a whole bunch of memorabilia from people in the regiment, explanations of individual battles, like at the Battle of Ypres, they broke through the canal, and Cambrai. It's very, very interesting pieces, regimental medals that people won, mascots, different items. And there's a football here, which I must admit, I remembered that. But it's not. It's something far more bonkers. Whilst the regiment was advancing across the no man's land, they had the idea of kicking footballs in front of them. Not many, but some of the officers. So that is a football that they kicked across no man's land as they advanced to kind of prove their contempt for the Germans, with the kind of losses you'd associate with going with that strategy. And there's some interesting weaponry here. There's I believe that's a German MG49. Back there is some quite recognisable First World War grenades and rifles and guns and machine guns. Here a bunch of Lee Enfield in the corner there. Bunch of different campaigns that the regiment fought in covered here. Very good explanation on the Second World War. There's a lot of material. It's a good regimental museum. Squeezed away inside this huge castle, and I would say probably not advertised well enough. You could walk around this castle and miss it altogether, and that would be a shame, because it is a decent museum. They've actually added here a digital shooting range, which is loads of fun, and I did take a little break to watch some of the tourists using it. It's quite fun. I would recommend choosing the children's level of difficulty. It's definitely a lot easier. I was quite impressed with some of the shooting. Again, hidden away in one of those side rooms on the courtyard is a very good explanation of the castle itself and how it was constructed, who constructed it, how the different portions grew, an explanation of the royal family, of the royals who came to visit, and the different attacks that happened on it. Really, most castles I go to, I'd be talking about a specific attack. With a grand castle like this, even we went to Upnor Castle a few weeks ago. It's a very small castle, but there's a significant battle to tie it to. Really, here there's one French attack which failed miserably that's forgotten by history. And really, this is an explanation of the House of Anjou, how Britain and northern France formed a empire and it basically collapsed within a couple of years, and the sons fought with each other over it, and ended up being split into two, and the other part obviously eventually became part of France. But it explains why years later we had Henry V attack with the whole Agincourt and the siege of Harfleur, because they had a family claim that they felt was as genuine as their claim to the crown of England. And there's a very good model which I really thought I'd captured on video, but I think looks pretty awful here. You get an idea of the structure, and it really is an excellent model of the keep of Dover Castle. But then walking out, we're going past that keep we just saw the model of, and you can see some historical reenactors heading to the keep for their next show. Unfortunately, no time, got to keep going, there's a lot to see. You just see them walking out of that archway there. That's actually the smaller of the two shops here, because much as we go to castles to see history, we want to have a little look at the shop, don't you? So there's one there, and there's one down at the far end here, which is kind of near the car park if you're lucky enough to get to park inside. Not this car park, the one down the far end. So walking down from the castle, you can see a fairly steep ramp down. We're heading towards some Georgian and Victorian houses. There's a medieval tower there next to the ice cream van, and there's the lighthouse and the church, St Mary in Castro, which is a very interesting church. It's an Anglo Saxon church which has been reconstructed, let's say, lovingly in the Victorian era by various amendments and additions to patch it together. But you can still see in the fabric of a church a lot of original details, and particularly some of the old doorways, though the decoration is all very new. You can see there's some Roman tiles in the wall structure. And here is what seems to have been an Anglo-Saxon coffin cover for a child's cover that was repurposed at some point as the separation between the two levels of the church where the rood screen would have been. But during the restoration, that was removed. And you can see some beautiful details. But you'd need a long time to really digest what's real and old and what's from a 19th century recreation. So we're outside now in the lighthouse, and from the inside it's quite hard to tell which bit's Roman and what's not. Obviously there's a cap on the top. That view I gave you earlier actually gives you a good idea of where it changes. It's roughly the third arch up where it comes in, but you don't really, it's quite hard to see it from the inside. Now it's more a bird's nesting site than a lighthouse, but it's quite a substantial site. Here, walking past St Mary in Castro, you can see there the old Anglo-Saxon door, and you can make out the red bricks which are probably from the Roman walls, the original Roman walls when there was a site here. But obviously those are long gone, because this has been a fortress that's in continual use from the Romans right the way through until really the 20th century. And now it's open to the public, but it was manned right the way through the Second World War. As I walk along this wall, you get a perspective for the size of the castle. We're about halfway through the castle, really. You can see the keep, you can see the outer ring of walls. Then you have this secondary defensive wall with the tower on the left there, which is medieval. Within that is this old Saxon and Roman heart, which you can actually visit this church as a church. It's the Regimental church, but it is still a live church and it does still do Sunday services. So someday I'm going to have to come here as just to attend the mass at the church and see how experiencing Dover Castle that way is. You can see here the structure of a lighthouse, and yes, it looks a little ragged and shabby, but that lighthouse is from about 200 AD, so really you're talking about 1800 years of standing against the elements on this hill. And if you put it in that perspective, that lighthouse is super impressive. You see here, there's the keep, and then after the keep, this secondary wall is around that. Then past that, there's the third wall with the long prow-shaped front. So really a very substantial site. This is why you can easily spend 6 hours here, and why 40 minutes in this video I'm trying to keep things quite quick. And we didn't get to see everything. You can see there where the skin is off, you can see some more of the Roman structure at this angle. Really very impressive. I do love a bit of Roman architecture, and if you watch our videos on Silchester or Caerwent or Caerleon, you see how the Romans built really robust, impressive architecture, which 2,000 years later still looks a lot better than a lot of buildings we build now will in a couple of 100 years. Despite all our building regulations, half the flats today they build have dozens of faults on them. Here you can see where at the top of the wall you can actually enter the watchtower there, but it's empty today. So we'll head down, and we're going to head over to the dynamo tunnels, which while I'm strolling here just say we're not allowed to film inside those tunnels. Now, very interesting, they are the tunnels where Operation Dynamo, the operation with the little ships to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk, were planned and organised from, and where throughout the Second World War there were substantial military operations because Dover effectively controlled the channel here. Unfortunately, no filming. Real shame, because they are very interesting. If you've seen Darkest Hour or you have any interest in that period of history, they are a must-see. But we're going to stroll down underneath the medieval tower where this car's going. Or probably. No, it's going to an ice cream. So down here, you can see this is about 600 years old. Pretty impressive, really. Even though the flooring, if you look closely, is scaffolding poles tied together with scaffolding boards on top so that there's some structure inside. The overall structure of this Colton's Gate, pretty impressive. And then you head down here. You can see this bank on the left. The bank on the left is the earthworks that the wall is on top of. So it's an internal earthworks. And certainly just another element of why this would be such a difficult castle to attack. Like, check out the angle of that. Okay, it's all overgrown now, but all of the approaches to the castle are 45 to 90 degree slopes, higher than your average house, and at the top is a defensible wall. Really, the scale of this castle is super impressive. Now we're going to walk across this open space. Over there is it's not really open to the public, but it's an old regimental building, some Second World War artillery, and in the background there you can see that brick tower with the flat top. Now we didn't get to there. Inside is some interesting, there's a periscope and there's some radar displays and planning equipment, and up on the top is that mast where they would signal to ships in the channel. So it's an interesting room, but given a choice between that and Dynamo, had to be the Dynamo tunnels. And if you want to see Dover Castle, come and visit. It's really great. After the Dynamo tunnels, we've done about a 30-minute tour, and they're every sort of 10-15 minutes, so you have to wait outside and be allowed in batches. But at the end, you have these rooms inside the cliffs where there's some interesting historical displays, mainly talking about the Second World War, Operation Dynamo, the planning of attacks across, and planning for spotting aircraft, its involvement in the Battle of Britain, its involvement really in just the overall defence, and the various players. And here we're talking about the coastal artillery. There's actually, on the outer of the walls that we didn't have time to get to today, is a series of anti-aircraft guns and some anti-ship guns. Very impressive collection of medium-sized batteries, but certainly interesting to see. So we're coming to the end of our shortened trip to Dover Castle. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. It's given you a flavour of just how much there is to see here. I'd say if you join English Heritage, Dover Castle and Stonehenge are the two big ones to see, partly because they're the expensive ones. So if you join, going to both of those pretty much pays off the membership. So if you visit as a tourist, you can actually get a 6-month or a 3-month, I believe it is, membership, which is pretty cheap if you're going to a lot of English Heritage. But if you're buying a membership for the year, visiting a string of smaller sites, you have to visit quite a few to pay off the membership. The second you go to Stonehenge and Dover, you're looking at the majority paid off. Actually, if you go to Dover and then go along the coast to Deal and Walmer, that does pay off the membership, going to Stonehenge, Dover, Deal and Walmer. And there's a very interesting history around the Cinque Ports along there. But I hope you enjoyed Dover Castle as much as I did. Please do like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about the channel, because we'd love to share some more history with you. We'll be doing a museum on Monday, and next Saturday we'll be back with another fascinating historical site. I'll do you a treat, and it'll be a short one but a famous one, so you have to come back next week to find out which one.